Joining us now is Andrew Pocock. He is Britain's new High Commissioner to Canada, having only just got here a month ago, and we welcome you to our shores and our country and our studio.
It's a pleasure to be here, Steve.
Nice to meet you. Well, even though you've only been here a month, I'm sure you are getting out and about and telling people why you're here and what your mission is. So why don't we start with that? What do you do here?
It's a very good question. I first of all represent the British government. I don't represent Her Majesty the Queen, which is the Governor-General's job. I run the High Commission in Ottawa, and I have supervisory responsibility for 3 other missions here. We have a Consulate General in Toronto that looks essentially after trade and investment. We have a mission in Vancouver, which looks at the politics of the Pacific and the trade and investment as well. And we have a mission in Montreal. And I suppose my job here is really to do 3 things, broadly speaking. The first is to maintain the outstandingly interesting, broad, deeply based relationship between Britain and Canada at the political, economic, defense, security level.
We do go back a bit, don't we?
We go back a couple of hundred years as friends and allies, and that's an important relationship to maintain and nurture and extend where possible. So that's one of the things. The second is, and I've touched on trade and investment, it's a core function for us here. Both the British Prime Minister, our Foreign Secretary, the Cabinet in general, see trade and investment as one of the core functions for the diplomatic service and for British representation overseas. So that again is a very broadly based, long established and mutually profitable relationship. So maintaining and extending that where possible is part of the function. And the third is to report on Canada to an eager government in London.
You're the eyes and ears, are you?
Indeed, and the legs, I hope, as well.
What are you telling them about us?
Well, I haven't got out into the far distances yet. And that is part of my mission. I'm here in Toronto on my first official visit, mainly to do business, and the business of Britain is increasingly business. Next week I'm out west to Vancouver and then to Calgary and Edmonton. And then I'll go to Montreal. So once I've done that, I'll be able to give a rather more penetrative portrait of Canada. But first impressions are immensely favourable. I've been very warmly received, if not by the weather, then certainly by everyone in Ottawa and indeed in Toronto.
Weather doesn't warmly receive anybody at this time of year, as you know.
Indeed.
You know, my hunch is if you ask Canadians what interests you most about the UK these days, the first thing they're going to say is that coalition government.
Yeah.
Because we kind of flirted with this a little bit a couple of years ago here, and it got everybody thinking about it. This, I guess, is the first British coalition government since World War II time.
It is indeed.
And let me ask broadly, how's it working out so far?
Well, it's working out, I think, better than perhaps even the architects of the coalition expected.
How so?
There's nothing like necessity, for one thing. I think that the recession out of which the British economy and Britain itself is beginning to emerge was an extraordinary context for a general election last year and an extraordinary cockpit in which to forge a political alliance of this newness and this importance. But it was the imperative of finding a stable form of government after an election which left the Conservative Party as a party with the greatest number of seats, but not an absolute majority in Parliament. But what was very clear was that the British people had voted for not merely change, but what they wanted was an element of stability, something that would permit the laying down of policy parameters and tram lines that would guide us out of recession.
Has that happened?
It is in the process of happening because while the recession, as I say, was the cockpit for forging an unprecedented peacetime alliance between 2 parties, it was also the context against which really radical public policy could be formulated. And in their different ways, and they come from different political traditions, both the Conservative Party and the Liberal Democrats have an extraordinary ambition for Britain. What we're seeing is a government that is determined to do a number of things, all of them difficult. The first is to tackle the financial deficit, which, as both leaders of the 2 parties have said, is unsustainable. The budget in June last year laid down quite extraordinary guidelines for doing that, and the implementation of that has begun. But the point of government is not simply to reduce deficit, even though that is essential for market confidence and a number of other things. Reducing the deficit is part of laying a foundation for economic growth. And the Prime Minister, the British Prime Minister's key priority is prosperity.
Let me follow up on all those things.
Certainly.
Because I know that when you're all in the same party, it's hard enough to agree behind the closed doors of the cabinet on timing, issues to tackle, issues not to tackle, the myriad of things that governments have to consider every day.
Indeed.
How are they doing this, given that, they're not in the same party, they didn't get there the same way? It sounds awfully unlikely that they'll be successful, but admittedly, so far they have been.
Well, I think again, context is everything here. When you were looking in the rearview mirror at the recession from which, as I say, we are beginning to emerge, concerns, as some economists have said, of double dip or of a slowdown in efforts to improve growth. This is an extraordinary stimulus, not just for the formation of fairly radical public policy, but for its implementation. Now, there's a great deal of discussion between the parties and among the parties and in the media and the public generally about aspects of government policy. But the need to implement what has been set out, the need to stick with implementation. The British economy took a dip in the last quarter of last year. It actually shrank GDP by 0.5 percentage point. The Chancellor was very quick to make clear that this didn't mean that we were about to change course. This was a blip, and it was important to forge ahead, to retain not just market confidence, but the impetus behind some of the policies as they moved forward. So I think that the need to succeed is a remarkable discipline in any profession, but in government, where there is very little leeway and you are mercilessly in the gaze in real time of public opinion and the media. There's a need for unified action, and I think we're seeing it.
My hunch is your Prime Minister and your Deputy Prime Minister, even though they're in different parties, probably get along better than the Prime Minister and some of the more right-wing elements in his party, and the Deputy PM and some of the more left-wing elements in his party. Fair to say?
I think what is fair to say is that the two elements of leadership have gelled remarkably well. They're men of the same age, both 45. It's not just policemen that are getting younger these days. And they find themselves with a very similar approach. Both men went into politics to change things. Both men have an opportunity to forge a radical and progressive policy that takes us out of recession.
But are some of their supporters chafing at some of what's being done?
Supporters chafe often, as you know, and I think that what will be important this year as we move through implementation of a very difficult series of measures, to see the pressures that come from the roots upwards. But the leadership is solid at the moment and needs to be. As
I mentioned earlier, we flirted with this a couple of years ago. There was the possibility after a so-called hung parliament, I guess, after the 2008 election, that we might get a coalition government in this country. As it happened, it didn't take place. But the specter of it is out there.
Indeed.
I know diplomats don't like to give advice to countries in which they have been living for all of a month, but we would be interested in some of the lessons that your coalition government has provided. So what would you offer in that regard? Well,
as you say, the circumstances are very different. And I'm not sure that we necessarily saw coalition government as a spectre. What it proved to be was an unexpected instrument for firm governance. What the Westminster system has traditionally provided is a single party with enough of a working majority to move policy forward. It didn't on this occasion. There was a pressing need to find an instrument that bridged that gap. So I think that the first lesson would be that the politicians listened to the pretty clear will of the country for a firm steer. This was not a time for advantage seeking among political parties. The public didn't want that. So it was a responsiveness, I think, to public opinion. And secondly, it was a willingness on both sides to make an accommodation. I don't think either side expected to be in coalition. And
Has Labour painted it as illegitimate?
No, I don't think they have painted it as illegitimate.
Because that's happened here. The Conservative government here, when the prospect of it was there, said this is illegitimate, this is not kosher. That hasn't happened in the UK.
Not at all. I mean, the party with the largest number of seats, the Conservative Party, is in government. There's nothing illegitimate about that.
Maybe that's the difference.
And it's perfectly possible for a government a party in that position to seek a partner to stabilize governance. And I think particularly in the Liberal Democrats, whatever they expected to do in the election, and they hoped to do well, I didn't think they necessarily expected to be a party of governance. They might have expected to be a party that was a swing voter in Parliament. But They were offered the opportunity, and as we see, they've seized it with both hands.
Let's talk about the austerity measures that the UK government is bringing in right now, because it is some pretty dramatic stuff. We're seeing an average of 19% cuts across mostly all departmental budgets. And your Chancellor of the Exchequer, your Finance Minister, has said the Canadian experience of the 1990s it has informed his thinking somewhat. How so?
I think it's informed his thinking in quite a major way. Canada in the early 1990s faced unsustainable public deficit. Fairly radical and draconian steps were needed. And what was decided was to cut public spending and to cut it across the board, to try and avoid picking favorites, even in government departments of particular sensitivity. And what was decided was, as a model, this made a great deal of sense. I think there are only two government departments where a budget cap has been avoided and the need for cuts. One is in our Department for International Development, and the second is in the National Health Service and Ministry of Health. Everything else, Defence, Foreign Office, all the other broad spending departments have taken and are continuing to take over the 4-year life of the settlement quite difficult cuts. There's no point being coy about it. The difference and the extra challenge here is not merely implementing it. I mean, that was the problem that the Canadian government faced too. But at least in the early 1990s, Canada was in the midst of, and the world more generally, in the midst of an economic uplift. We're emerging from a fairly severe recession, and there isn't a great deal of leeway. So it is unquestionably a challenge.
High Commissioner, I'm going to read you your favorite columnist from the Financial Times.
Indeed.
Here's Martin Wolf. Here's what he's had to say. The preliminary figures on UK gross domestic product for the fourth quarter of last year were a shock. Where is the robust recovery that justified the government's rapid fiscal retrenchment? In a word, nowhere. I find it hard to understand why the government is so confident that the economy would withstand the sharp fiscal squeeze that lies ahead. If any such overconfidence existed before these latest numbers, it should now have gone. What's your reaction to that?
Mr. Wolf, of course, is entitled to his very well-informed opinion. What I would say is this, that before the fourth quarter figures of last year, we'd seen a period of modest but steady growth throughout that calendar year. And many of the reasons for the dip, which I mentioned earlier on in the fourth quarter, were what you would call unusual exogenous shock, an extraordinarily cold December, the closing down of transport and other infrastructure, a loss of productivity as a consequence. What we've seen in January, and we're not deeply into the new financial, the last quarter yet, what we've seen is a modest rebound. What the IMF are predicting is 2% growth in the British economy for the rest of this year. So I think, without being overconfident or brash about this, that the last quarter was a blip. What is certainly the consequence is a renewed government commitment to sticking to the course. It's been a process of fiscal consolidation that's been broadly welcomed in the markets and elsewhere. I think what's needed is a degree of confidence and determination, not to let one quarter's one-off event distort general policy, and I think sticking to the course is what we're seeing.
One doesn't want to extrapolate too much from the Canadian experience, but my recollection was people in the main went along with it here because they saw at the end of the day a program that they thought would work and get us back into a sustainable circumstance. Is that yet the case in the UK?
I think the answer is it's very early days still, and we're getting slightly mixed indicators. Value-added tax, the GST here, has gone up to 20%, so there's been a mild inflationary effect.
You have a 20% VAT.
Yes.
And ours is 5.
Indeed.
And people don't like paying 5.
No one likes paying VAT at all, I suspect. But a mild inflationary effect in that, inflation's about 4%. But again, over the medium term and the next financial year, drifting down to 2% again, looks to be well within possibility. But it is still early. Unemployment is 7.9%, but that's still less than some other developed economies. It's 9% in the United States and 10% in the Eurozone. So one is holding one's own, and it is too early to say that we've seen dramatic success. But I think time is needed. The recovery will be choppy. The government's been very plain about that. But maintaining that rigid discipline on the deficit is not something that we can simply back away from. Interest payments are £43 billion a year, interest payments alone. that can't go on. So I think that one needs a slightly longer period of test and reaction before you can make any announcements that this isn't working. And the government is determined to stay that course.
Just finally, in our last minute here, how do you like living in the Scotsman's home?
Very much. If there's a ghost in Earnscliffe, it's a very benevolent one.
I should explain that. You're living in Sir Johnny MacDonald's old house?
Indeed. And this is the 120th anniversary, I think, of his death. It's a splendid old place. We have it in a kind of custodianship, I think, for the Canadian people. And if we can use the house in the course perhaps of next year, when it's the 200th anniversary of the War of 1812, and open it more broadly to Canadians to come and have a look, we shall.
Excellent. High Commissioner, welcome to Canada. Good luck with your job.
Thank you very much, Steve.